You're starting it, right?
Hey, what's up, guys? Battleborn Media Networks going live for a special community highlight segment this week. In today's show, we have a nationally recognized guest who's literally been on the front lines of this pandemic since the very beginning. She saves hundreds, if not thousands, of lives around the world and continues to help patients around the nation as we speak against this virus. You've definitely seen her on social media platforms. I think she was on the Today Show, am I mistaken there?
I was mentioned in USA Today.
USA Today, that's what it was.
And the New York Post.
And the New York Post. Okay. Sorry about the confusion there. But she's also an organizer and leader of American Frontline Nurses. She's a local resident, mother, wife, and a nurse. Her name is Nicole Sirotek. I've known Nicole's husband and his family from the sports world for many years, but we've just recently been introduced to each other over the last year or so. So welcome in, Nicole. Thanks for taking some time to sit with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, your passion in nursing, which is amazing. I've heard you speak to your nurses and talk about nursing, so it's definitely a passion. So go ahead and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about yourself and how this pandemic has affected you personally.
Okay, so thank you for having me on. I always like grassroots movement media because it's just so much more personal. And you reach, I feel like you reach a lot more people in each selected community. So for everyone who doesn't know, my name is Nicole Sirotek. I'm a registered nurse. I've been a registered nurse for, I think, going on 11 years now. My specialty is critical care, trauma, and flight, though I've done all sorts of types of nursing from long-term care to home health, infusion, woundostomy, continence nursing, lots of different things. But my predominant specialty is critical care and flight. I guess where people know me, unfortunately, is from this foul-mouthed video from May of 2020 when I went to New York City to help work on the front lines of the COVID pandemic. And when I get there, things are not like what they were on the news.
Sure.
I'm just like, what is going on in here? They're literally murdering these people. And, I had tried to get a hold of all of the appropriate services, all the appropriate organizations, go up my chain of command, everything that we've always been taught in nursing what to do to advocate for a patient. And they just kept handing me a cookie and telling me, oh, I'm doing a great job. You're not going to save everybody. And then finally it comes down to, they wanted me to hang this experimental drug that I knew that was killing everybody. And I refused to do it. And then they transferred me units because I wouldn't, do what I was told to do. And that's how that video was made, and it went around the world several times, translated into multiple different languages. Most predominantly, I'm really well known in India and most of Spanish-speaking America, so Latin America, South America, for all of my advocacy and things like that. And when I came back from New York, I ended up founding American Frontline Nurses, where we recruited all of these nurses to be nurse advocates to help advocate for people who are in the hospital or to help instruct you on early intervention, because that's pretty much what nurses do. We educate people. That's one of the largest parts of our job description. And to help people out and keep people out of the hospitals and get people out of the hospitals and get people extubated. Our slogan is educate, equip, and empower, but we kind of joke around and say it's educate, extubate, and empower. So we have a really high survival rate. I think it's 99% of the people that we help on early intervention never end up going into the hospital. And we have probably almost a 90% survival rate in the hospital, and we can about a 75% extubation rate with all of our people.
And that's sorry, Pedro. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today is the actual problem. I mean, we're not here to say that this virus isn't a thing. We're not.
Yeah, I don't get involved in politics.
Yeah. And that was my next statement is we're not talking politically. We've avoided the discussion for that simple fact because it's almost like talking religion with the other side. You just you never really get.
I ain't got time for politics.
You don't do that. You don't talk religion or politics.
Yeah, exactly.
But I have one question before we move on.
Oh, you don't talk.
I can talk sports.
Yeah, we can talk sports. But the one question on one of the things that you did say at the beginning of your statement when you went to New York, you said that your thoughts were these people are being murdered. Can you describe why you think that? And
yeah, sure. So I was like everyone else when this pandemic started. I was disinfecting my apples. I was like, no shoes in the house. I was bleaching everything. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's just like, what our science professors told us is going to happen. And then you go to New York, and I've worked hot zones before. I've worked Ebola. I've worked the measles outbreak. I mean, this wasn't something that was like, ooh, you have your protocols and your incident command and how you should approach. So we get there, and it is not how I've ever worked in a hot zone before. We get there, and it's just absolute freaking chaos. And in this chaos, we have to keep people alive, and they're dying at such an abrupt rate that we're piling bodies up in the hallway because we ran out of body bags, and we can't pre-stage the bodies in the freezer trucks fast enough. And I'm like, what is going on here? And then you're just like, then you start asking questions. Well, first you had the wrong type of doctors. We had gynecologists, we had podiatrists, we had dentists. What was some other crazy stuff? We had pediatricians that were treating adult patients. And then we had the wrong type of nurses. Because remember, guys, like, you can search this up on Google. The news was all, we need nurses, right?
Right. Huge nurse shortage.
Nurses. Did anyone stop to think that if we need, how many ventilators did Cuomo need? 30,000 vents?
Something ridiculous like that. Yes.
Did you bother to think to get 30,000 feeding pumps to feed these people on these vents? Did you stop to think that maybe we needed 30,000 respiratory therapists whose literal profession is airway? No, you just wanted nurses. And this came back to the concept that nobody knew exactly what a nurse did. They're just like, nurses save lives. My husband doesn't even know what I fully do. He's like, well, I don't know. She flies around in a helicopter and she gives old people medicine. I'm like, okay, that's kind of some of what I do, but not really. But nurses are actually specialized, just like doctors are specialized. So they brought in school nurses, because remember, the schools were closed. They brought in OR nurses. Remember, the ORs were closed. They brought in retired nurses. And in New York, the governor wrote an order where the student nurses with 1 semester of nursing school, 2 semesters of nursing school can come in and work as full-fledged nurses. Medical students were working as full-fledged doctors with 1 year of medical school. I don't know if you've ever seen medical school curriculum. You're still learning anatomy and physiology and some basic meds. You don't know how to manage a ventilator. And so all of these things, and then they threw in a bunch of defective ventilators from the emergency stockpile, because you can Google this. It's a CNN article. They did not fund the maintenance on these ventilators. And so half of them were actually defective and killing the patients to begin with. This is why they ended up not using all those vents. They were giving them away, remember, on the news, to other states.
Right.
So you had the wrong doctors, you had the wrong nurses, you had the absence of the necessary professionals that you needed, and you had the wrong equipment and defunct equipment. Because if anyone knows, when you go into acute respiratory distress syndrome and then later into multi-organ system failure, first thing that typically goes down is your kidneys. Did anyone stop to think to bring in dialysis nurses? No. Did anyone stop to think that maybe if we need 30,000 vents, maybe we need 20,000 dialysis machines and the appropriately trained staff to manage those? They tried to have me manage a dialysis machine, and I'm like, I have never touched a dialysis machine in my life. I'm like, I can manage this vent. I have no freaking clue how to manage a dialysis machine. And it was just like, well, you're a nurse. That's literally what the doctor said. Well, you're a nurse. And I'm like, yeah, and you're a doctor. How come you don't know how to manage your vent? And I'm managing it. And I'm just like, we're specialized in our field. And then you're trying to explain to a gynecologist how to manage a vent when normally he does pap smears. And I'm like, oh, okay, we are in a lot of trouble. And then so it was the wrong staff, the wrong skill set, the wrong equipment. And then on top of that, you are turning over staff so fast that people aren't paying attention to basic medicine. If you're a diabetic, were you getting your insulin and your oral diabetic agents? No. If you are someone with low thyroid issues, were you getting your thyroid medicine? No. If you're someone who had was on Coumadin for atrial fibrillation, were you getting your blood thinners? No. Were we feeding these people? Were we giving them water? I remember one time I had heard of a stash of equipment up on another unit, so I ran up to that unit to get this equipment. And I'm running by a room, and there's this little old lady, and she's reaching out for her tray of food. And mind you, it's 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. That was her breakfast tray from that morning. So where was lunch and dinner? And no one even put the straw in the milk or buttered the toast or whatever it was. It just like, and then you go up there the next day because of that secret stash of equipment, and she was gone. Because you can look at her, she's dying.
Right.
Why wasn't anyone feeding these people? Oh, well, they don't want you to go into those rooms more than like 4 times a shift. I'm like, so you're not going to feed them? I mean, how many times did we have a medical student intubate somebody and rupture their esophagus? Or how many times did we have someone on a vent on fentanyl, which is a narcotic, that slows down your GI tract, and nobody's paid attention that the person on the vent hasn't had a bowel movement in 2 weeks, and then they end up having like a bowel obstruction, and they actually die from paralytic ileus.
What is that?
It's like a paralyzed bowel. Like your bowel is supposed to like milk like a snake almost to like get your stool out, but it can become blocked when you use narcotic medication. We use fentanyl a lot for sedation, and I'm like, when was the last time this person like had a bowel movement? You can actually die from not having a bowel movement, guys. So just in case you don't know, you can't go 2 weeks without pooping. It will actually harm you. Or, did anyone pay attention that the guy gained 30 pounds of water weight because his kidneys aren't working optimally, and we should probably, get him on a diuretic or something like that. So the guy had COVID, but he actually died of pulmonary edema secondary to fluid volume overload because you're pumping a liter of fluid into him every hour because nobody questioned the orders.
Right.
Because the gynecologist wrote the orders, and he's used to having to fluid volume overload people because they just have a baby and they lose a bunch of blood volume.
Right.
So there was all of these mistakes that were done. And honestly, since New York, I believe like the actual standard of care in America is actually been lowered. So when we work with these hospitals and families are like, hey, I need help advocating for my loved one in the hospital, I literally am still telling people, are they being fed? Is there a tube feeding going on? Like if they're on a vent, or are you sending them 3 meals a day in the hospital? I'm like, you can't isolate them for 72 hours at a time because they have COVID. I'm like, when was the last time they had a bowel movement? Do you know this person is actually in like a diabetic crisis? They don't have COVID. It is going to mimic something like respiratory failure if you don't give him his insulin.
It seems like that should be something that's fairly a no-brainer. But if you have, like you said, non-specialized nurses, then they don't.
Even now, like I was on the front lines in like Texas and California. I remember getting shift change from like this nurse that had only been like a nurse for like 5 months, and I'm like, she's like telling me off all these labs. I'm like, hey, this guy's like, middle-aged Hispanic male. He doesn't speak English. In all these labs that you're telling me, this is all indicative of him being a newly onset diabetic. He's like in DKA crisis. I'm like, so why are we treating him for COVID when he needs insulin and electrolyte balances and the appropriate fluids? And she like literally said, she's like, well, I'm like, how come you haven't talked to the doctor about this? And she's like, oh, well, that's above my pay grade. And I'm like, actually, that is your pay grade. You need to go tell the doc that he's in DKA because nobody's caught this in 3 days, and this is why he's on a vent. Had the guy extubated by the morning.
Wow.
So I was the first person on that unit in like 16 months or something that had been extubated. He wasn't there for COVID. His false PCR test said that he had COVID. They treated him for COVID, but he actually was there for diabetic, ketoacidosis and a diabetic crisis.
So tell us a little about your education and your specialization as far as being a nurse. Because you're talking about all these kinds of nurses and whatnot. What's your background in nursing and
Yeah, so previously, before I was a nurse, I actually was educated in biochemistry and psychology, so I have several degrees in that. That's kind of where a lot of my like foreign work came from, with like viruses and things like that, tracking the genetic mutations in like the HIV virus, bioinformation processing, stuff like that. And then later I switched to nursing like many people do because I actually want to help people, not just be in a lab, something like that. And so I became a nurse, and I got my associate's degree from Truckee Meadows Community College. I got my bachelor's degree from Great Basin College, and then I'm working on my doctorate of nurse practitioner as well. But my specialty's always been like critical care. Like I tell people, I'm like, I don't do OB. Like I've delivered a couple babies like out in the field or whatnot, but I'm like, no, I don't do babies. I don't do NICU. Like, I've always done like, critical care medicine and things like that. So, I mean, that's what my specialty is. And once you leave nursing school, you typically specialize. Everyone finds their little their little foxhole that they like to be in. Like, I don't like doing ER whatsoever. You put an ER nurse in the ICU and they're like, I'm over this. You put an ICU nurse down the ER, they're like, I'm like, send me back to my controlled chaos.
So critical care, so that, and I was thinking ER, but it's more of like ICU type.
Yeah, so the best way I can describe it is like, ER is the one that like storms the bays of Normandy, and then once they take all the bullets, then the ICU comes in and cleans up and maintains.
There you go, and actually saves.
We're
the lives.
Organized chaos.
Organized chaos.
Is in the ICU, but it's complete chaos down in the ER.
Yeah, no kidding.
So describe what you said foreign, and I heard you when we were talking before we went live, talking about different countries that you've been to and traveled to. What exactly did you do or have you done when you do that type of stuff?
So, since New York, believe it or not, I'm actually one of the world's leading experts in COVID patient ventilator management and early intervention strategies using the FLCCC IMAS protocol. So a lot of the times foreign countries like, regional areas would get a hold of me and they're like, hey, can you help us with our COVID intervention strategies? We need to get our case numbers down because in foreign countries, they don't have, like, I don't know if you've ever been to like Johannesburg, they don't have a large hospital system.
Where's Johannesburg?
It's in it's in like South Africa, where it's like they'll have so many people coming in to like birth a baby that like they'll give you like a grass mat on the floor because there's just not enough beds. There's just not enough hospital systems, or you're going into a field hospital or something like that. And so they're like, most people are like, oh, here in the United States, it's like, just come back when you can't breathe. That's pretty much how the doctors treat it here in the United States. But in other countries, especially developing nations like, India, South America, parts of like the continent of Africa, they are all about early intervention strategies. And so they're like, how can we reach all of these people? We need a trusted person. And by then, like I said, I was like really big in like South America and stuff like that. Can you start educating your doctors, telling them like, what do we do? We need a mass public health plan rollout. And that's what I would do. I'm like, being like in South America, I'm known as La Enferma Gringa. Make sure your keyboard's in Spanish or you get porn instead. But like typically my picture will come up because that's what they like captioned me as in the news articles. And I did like a lot of like media down with like Telemundo and like radio stations and stuff like that.
In South Africa or South America?
South America.
Okay.
I try not to like stray too far from the United States so I don't get like locked out of the country again. And so we just come up with like an actual intervention strategy. And most people don't know that the FLCCC protocol, which is the Frontline COVID Critical Care Alliance with Dr. Pierre Corey and Dr. Merck, their whole champion drug is ivermectin. And like 20 years ago when I was traveling overseas, they were using it for things like herpes outbreaks. They were using it for the flu. It's actually been an antiviral for years, like decades. It's just new to being used as an antiviral in first world countries. So they championed all the research on using ivermectin to treat, COVID. Probably shouldn't say that. Say the Rona. So we don't get it censored. And I'm going to refer to that dewormer drug as IVM, so we don't get censored for that one too. I completely forgot. So you use IVM, which is a dewormer. It works as an anti-parasite. It's actually comes from a fungus. The founder of it actually won a Nobel Prize in like 2015 for it. It's on the WHO's list of like most important drugs to stock for your emergency stockpile. So it's actually been used as an antiviral for years. Like I've used it for cold sores for years. All sorts of stuff.
So not trying to cut you off.
Yeah.
So let's that just rolls right into where I wanted to go is the treatment of or the lack of treatment early on, and we've had discussions. I've had a couple of friends, family members that have came down with it, and of course my first call was to you, and we went kind of through those steps. So so now that we're here in 2022, what can people do to prevent catching it, and what can they do early on in the treatment so it doesn't get to the ventilation stage?
Well, so we talked a little bit about ivermectin. So where you can get it is most doctors are not going to prescribe it. Period. Most of them aren't. You have to have like a more freedom-minded, more, I actually follow the research type doctor. So if you need to find a prescriber, I always recommend if you go to our website, American frontlinenurses.com, and there's an early intervention tab. Underneath there are all the resources you need. So you can go to myfreedoctor.com, which is owned by Dr. Ben Marvel. He's a super great doc. You can go to Push Health. They're the fastest so far. And you just get your ivermectin and you take it according to the FLCCC mask protocol, which is 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. And we have like a weight-based chart and everything like that to help you figure it out. And you just take that and you just move on with your day. Because I mean, there are supplements you want to take. If you go to Natural Nutrition and talk to Arlene and Debbie, they already have like the supplement protocol ready to go to with the IMASC protocol. So you just tell them that that's what you need and they'll grab everything that you need. But I mean, I've caught COVID like 7 times. So it's like nothing now. I mean, when I caught it the first time, I didn't even know I had it. I mean, I caught all the bad stuff, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant. I caught Delta twice. All sorts of stuff, because my stuff will get sent out to be sequenced, and I'm just like, it's not an issue if you have early intervention. The problem is that if you ask your doctor, well, what can I take if I have COVID? They're going to either give you a steroid or an antibiotic. And first off, the steroid's only going to work once you're into the late inflammatory stage, but by then you're already in a bad state. And then if you get an antibiotic, well, antibiotics don't work on viral infections. It's only going to work if you have a secondary bacterial pneumonia that you develop, which does happen, but it's not going to stop the COVID. So you just have to get your early intervention from the appropriate doctor, and you'll be just fine.
So that I have a question, because I did speak with someone who is familiar with medical stuff. Mm-hmm. And she, because I had someone affected, or I was affected by the virus also, very much so. But she had asked if they put her on steroids, mm-hmm. and they did. So what is the negative about steroids to treat this?
Well, if you go,
and what do they do? Also, sorry.
Well, it just depends on what steroids you're getting. And most people are being prescribed corticosteroids, and they'll work once you've actually reached what's called the inflammatory state of Rona. And they're important when you're actually hospitalized for it, or if you're experiencing symptoms of long haulers, but it's actually not going to shut down the actual viral replication. So this is why some people, even though that they were given a steroid, still continue to get worse. So I mean, typically when when we're in South America and we're giving out those care kits like we did in El Salvador, we send out zinc, IVM, and vitamin C, and sometimes doxycycline, because all that stuff you can buy over the counter in South America. Steroids are very rarely ever given out. So the fact that doctors just prescribe steroid packs and azithromycin all the time is bizarre, because it's not really going to do anything unless you A, develop a secondary bacterial pneumonia, or B, you are into an inflammatory state, the late stage of COVID, and that's still not going to stop the viral replication. That's where the IVM would come into place. So I don't really know what the thought process is. Everyone's just following orders. So I'm like, all right, you follow those orders. I'm going to save all these people over here. Keep doing what you're doing, I guess.
So you don't know, because I lost someone to this virus, and that's basically, from the sounds of it, I don't know. I didn't see her actual chart or anything, but it sounded like they were basically just pumping her full of steroids. Mm-hmm. From the sounds of it. So what's the thought? I know you kind of said you don't, but what is it supposed to do? Or
what it's supposed to do, depending upon the steroid, so the most common one being a corticosteroid, a glucocorticosteroid, they typically work on interleukin 6, interleukin 8, mast cell activation, and foam cells. So it's supposed to kind of slow down the cytokine storm, but if the cytokine storm is being created by a virus that keeps replicating, it's I use this analogy. It's if you send the firefighters out there and they're putting out the fire doesn't go away until you stop, the police take out the guy that's with the flamethrower, right? Once you take out the guy with the flamethrower, the firefighters can actually take out the fire. effectively, but they can't if someone keeps starting a fire. And it's the same thing. It's like we often tell people to use the monoclonal antibody tocilizumab too. It's a potent interleukin-6 inhibitor. They use it for rheumatoid arthritis. And I'm like, you can do that, but I'm like, until you get on top of the virus with IVM, it's still going to keep replicating and still creating that inflammatory cytokine storm. So it's like steroids are a downstream like intervention when you need to go upstream while simultaneously mitigating the damage and the response to the inflammatory process, because that inflammatory process is what is causing your pulmonary infiltrates, your pulmonary edema, and the fibrosis to your lungs. So yes, it does have a place, but it's not the only thing that's going to work. I mean, unless your body can naturally launch an immune response strong enough and robust enough to mitigate that virus and take care of it naturally, then you keep going down in the worsening path, no matter what your steroid levels are or steroid dosages, down to the route of ventilator and multi-organ system failure.
Okay. Did you catch all that, Danny?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'll go back and watch again. But obviously, you're not just pulling words out of your ass over there. You know what you're talking about. Yeah. So explain.
You can't cuss on there,
explain a little bit, I mean, and kind of dumb it down for us dumb jocks here. But so there's a lot of misconception out there that the Rona's just the flu, and then now we have all these other variants, and you know, explain that to the lay person, if you will, the difference between Rona and influenza, if you will, the other day, and then how these variants come about and what that really is, what that really means.
Okay, so how I explain like the flu versus Rona is it's like you have a cat and you have a dog, and they both have 4 legs, and they all have tails, and they all have ears, and they all have whiskers, and they all have sharp teeth. That's like because they're both mammals, right? Like the flu and the Rona are both viruses, so they have like these similarities, but the structures are completely different. Like, you know, Saint Bernard is completely different from like, you know, an orange tabby cat. You know, they look visually different. Same with the flu and same with Rona. Now, I don't even concern myself as to where Rona came from. Y'all can fight over that yourself, but I got lives to save in real time, so y'all can take that fight somewhere else. Doesn't change the fact that people are dying from it. So the difference between the flu and the Rona is like the genetic sequence and the actual carrying thing, because like I said, they're structurally different. And so what causes the Rona to actually cause the dysfunction and the damage to the body that it does is the actual spike protein. So the Rona is a circle and it has these little pokies coming out of it. Those spike are actually what attaches to your what's called your ACE2 receptor, and then it, you know, releases its like what you would call like a payload, its genetic material into the human cell, where then it hijacks the cellular machinery and tells the cell to make more of itself. That's how viruses replicate. The flu does something very similar. It just has a different lock and key mechanism. So the flu, yes, a traditional corona like virus, should cause, you know, flu, sniffling, sneezy, runny nose. Sometimes they cause some upset stomach.
Like a Nicole commercial.
Like the Nicole commercial. Okay. Like Omicron does now. That kind of stuff. But this one has some genetic mutations that causes this cytokine storm and, you know, creates this inflammatory process. So, I mean, you can die from the flu just like you can die from, you know, Rona. I mean, I almost died from the flu like a couple years back, and I'm like, oh, crap. So, I mean, and I was a healthy person that ran marathons, and I almost died from the flu. So, I mean, anyone can die from any type of virus. It typically, when we compare this to like the 1918 influenza, which I was part of like the team that like resequenced that virus, like based off of like autopsy results and stuff like that, is that it typically, like any virus, would take out the old and like the weak and the frail. But with this one, we're seeing that it's definitely, it's like sparing the kids, even the medically, you know, needy or medically frail children. It's sparing them. And it's typically going after the men. Sorry, guys. Because like most of our people that we're saving are actually like men. It's very rare that we ever get like a pregnant lady, or very rare that we ever get like a kid or something like that. So like the demographics are also off from like an evolutionary standpoint. And so when we talk about variants, it's like really interesting to see that people just like freak out over like these variants, because I'm like, variants happen every year with every single virus. Like if you guys get a flu shot, you know, you have to get a flu shot every year because they anticipate like what's called an antigenetic like drift and like the sequence. Like, okay, it looks like this one's going to be the variant of concern. Let's make a flu vaccine with this sequence And then that's what we're going to give everybody. So there are variants every year. Like, you actually have like 30 different variants for HIV. So, with the two biggest categories being sub-Saharan type 1 and sub-Saharan type 2. So I'm like, when people freak out over the variant, I'm like, okay, so I don't get why people freak out. The only thing that was like definitely different from the original Rona to like Delta is that because they introduced like the jab, it created what was called a selective evolutionary pressure for a faster replicating, faster, like spreading, easily transmissible virus. And so when we saw like that like genetic drift and that when that virus became the more dominant variant, the Delta, we definitely saw like, so the original like Rona, we knew that if you hadn't kicked it by day 10, like you're probably in another 5 to 10 days going to end up in the hospital. When it came to Delta, if you hadn't kicked it by day 3, you were in trouble by day 5 to day 7. So it actually, what they call the replication factor, actually, doubled. So it replicated at a much faster rate, making you go critical much more faster. And then now we have what's called Omicron, which technically, if you compare this to 1918 influenza, and there's this really super great book called The 1918 Influenza by something Barney or something like that. It's like an 11-hour audio book. I really recommend you getting it because we're making all the same exact mistakes that we did in 1918. So I'm just like, oh, goodness gracious. So this goes back to, now we have Omicron, which technically would have been the second wave. It's a much more docile, like less lethal, more traditional symptomology type variant. And honestly, like I was just talking to Jessica Rose. She's like one of the leading like computational virologists from like Israel. We were just talking with her yesterday, and she's like, this is like a gift because everyone can get this virus and do just fine. It's a traditional cold virus. So everyone will get their natural immunity, and we can stop with all this madness. Because if we hadn't introduced the jab, we would have gotten like the Omicron variant, like type thing. And you guys can always go onto the actual CDC website and check, what's called a variant of concern or a variant of interest. You can actually see the entire Rona phylogenetic tree on NCBI because I'm always like watching it. It's like when I show people like what the phylogenetic tree is with all the variant offshoots, they're like, what? This is available online? I'm like, yeah, it's been available online for every single virus, like forever. Like, where y'all been? So it's actually like really interesting. Like, that's why I'm like, if we were on a Zoom, I could just like bring up my screen, but they kick me out a lot because I run a lot of blasts to kind of like compare the viruses and stuff. But I don't know. And that's not to poo-poo people who are like, who have lost a loved one or who are struggling with COVID long haulers and that, because if I can catch COVID 7 times, if I can keep all of my family out of the hospital, if I can literally save thousands of lives, like literally in real time, how come everyone else can't do that? And I'm not even a doctor. I can't even write prescriptions. I can't even, like, I can tell you, well, you should definitely go take this medication, but I can't write a medication for anything. The doctor has to. I don't practice medicine. And I'm like, how is it that the nurse knows more than the doctor? And like, when people listen to the nurse, they're living. Maybe because it's science.
So is the question I have on the variants, and this may be a really stupid question, but my question is, so we had the alpha, we got to Delta, and then all of a sudden we jumped all the way to Omicron. Like they have names for hurricanes and they go through the Greek alphabet, whatever. So,
hurricane, I think, are typically women. Yeah, women names. There's like a system for like naming these things.
They do it like how they do hurricanes. Is that what they do? Like,
well, hurricanes use female names, but viruses, they always use like, it's actually a call number. Like Delta is like part of like the P1.1 generation, like, or lineage or something like that. There's actually a system for it. There's like a whole nomenclature.
Okay, I was just wondering how we went from Delta all the way to Omicron.
Well, yeah, there's like Epsilon. There's like a whole bunch of other ones that like fizzle out. It's like if people know about like the theory of evolution and like selective like species, like survival of the fittest, whichever virus like variant can spread faster becomes the more dominant one. It's like the biggest lion, strongest lion, the fastest zebra. They, move on to replicate or reproduce or whatever if you're talking about animals, but replicate if you're a virus, and that becomes the more dominant like variant. So you outcompete the weaker strains.
So is Delta still out there since it sounded to be the strongest one?
Yeah, but Omicron is like coming onto the scene, which I always thought was interesting because now, like, I read in the Elko Daily, it's like Omicron is like prevalent. And I'm like, dude, according to the epidemiological models, it hasn't even reached us yet. So I don't even know what y'all are doing. Like, just an FYI, guys, the hospital has no sequencing technology. So if they're telling you you have Omicron, I don't even know how they're telling you you have Omicron, because it takes like a week to 2 weeks to get it sequenced. Okay. Like,
So I do have to throw out a little fun fact that Danny asked for the dumb it down version of her her answer with what she started talking about the variants and all, and I can't imagine what the scientific answer would have sounded
you gotta
like.
talk to Dr. Malone. I'm like, wow. We had Jessica Rose like on yesterday. I was talking with her. I'm like, oh my gosh, Dr. Rose, can you be my new BFF, because like I love everything you're saying, because like it's totally like what the science textbooks tell us. You should definitely talk to Dr. Malone.
About halfway through your statement, because Danny, I mean, that's what he seriously asked. He's like, just dumb it down for us, a couple of jocks, and then I'm like halfway through.
Well,
I was like,
you gotta always kind of explain some of the like scientific stuff behind it, but it's just like this stuff, none of this is different from any other virus or whatnot, because people, like, here's what I tell people is like, people are not dying in their homes. Like when I worked the Ebola outbreak, we were dragging dead bodies out of homes because people were dying in their homes. They were dropping like literally like flies. In 1918, they actually had a system for picking up bodies from, like, you had to put like a blue handkerchief or a blue piece of fabric on your door, or a gray piece. It'll tell you if people were sick in there or if there were bodies that had to be collected. Like, really, read that book, The Great Influenza.
That's in it, The Great Influenza?
Yeah, The Great Influenza.
I'm
Last name is like Barney or something like that.
Is it Barry?
Barry, that's it.
John Barry.
Yeah, just go onto Amazon, get the audiobook, and then you can listen to it while you're like, running errands and stuff like that. It's super great. But it's just, people are only dying in the hospitals. Okay, that should tell you something about it. And that's not because the sickest people go to the hospital. I'm like, we break plenty of people out of the hospital that, like, why are you there? Oh, well, they said that I need to stay here because I'm, like, critical. I'm like, are you on oxygen? No. Can you walk up and go to the potty by yourself? Yeah. Can you eat and feed yourself and dress yourself and take a shower? Yeah. I'm like, then go home.
You're not critical.
You're not critical. You're taking up a bed. Get the hell out of the ER. Get out of med surge.
Right? Yeah, no kidding. So let's talk a little bit about American, and we say that slowly because that's crucial. The American part of it. So American frontline nurses and the doctors you work with, Dr. McCollum, I think his name was. He was on Joe Rogan here the other day, and if you haven't watched it, go watch that.
So Dr. Bartlett, Dr. Artis, Dr. Malone, the head guy that created mRNA technology and stuff like that. Yeah.
So talk about what American frontline nurses does, because you talk about advocates and whatnot, and people might not understand exactly what that means. So explain what you do, what your organization is.
Yeah. So we're American frontline nurses, and I really stress that you have to write the word American frontline and then nurses.com, because some people, when they go to find us, it'll like go to like weird scam sites and stuff like that. And that's what happened with one family in Illinois. It took them 3 days trying to track us down. And I'm like, oh my goodness. Because they needed a nurse advocate. So it's really interesting, because when they teach nurses what advocacy work is, they always talk about policy reform, healthcare policy. And I'm like, that's a real great upstream thinking on like, yes, we must change healthcare policy in order to make greater, lasting, more widespread changes. But in the meantime, people are dying now. So we need an advocate at the bedside now. And typically your bedside nurse should be your advocate. They should be like, hey, by the way, doc, this is what's going on. Or talk to the unit manager. Hey, there's this process flow breakdown that, could potentially harm patients. But they'll just fire the nurse, so the nurses don't speak up. And you can ask any nurse about that. Ask them if they feel comfortable correcting anybody, and they will tell you no, because they'll probably get fired or get on the radar. And so what we do is all these nurses that didn't want to bow down to the mandate, a lot of them have come to us and they're like, well, we still want to help. We still want to like save lives, but we're not going to be part of this like system where we're, either going to have to be part of a medical experiment, or we're going to watch the murder people in the hospitals. And I'm like, oh, well, we've got a team for you. So how we define like a nurse advocate is someone that's going to actually educate, equip, and empower you on what you need to do when you have COVID. And we don't just do Rona too. We have people that have like NICU babies with like chronic issues. We have people like that need to like help with like, chronic illness management. Someone who had complications post-surgery. Healthcare is a huge bureaucracy, and if you don't know how to navigate it, then you can get lost and get like slip through the cracks. So our nurse advocates, predominantly right now we're dealing with Rona issues in the hospital, is that we make sure that you get safe, equitable, and appropriate care. And And that goes back into we train and teach the advocates. I'm like, these are all the things you need to look for. Like, if you're on a vent, are you being fed? Like, are they managing your fluid volume overload? I mean, these are just a couple things. When was the last time somebody checked an ABG, which is an arterial blood gas, to see the effects that the ventilator is doing? One time, a person had been on a ventilator for a week without a single ABG, and I'm like, that's a basic standard of care. You know, you can't be on a vent and not be getting ABGs. You know, you can't. You know, how come they're not on Lovenox for deep vein thrombosis prophylactic? Because that's a JCO and a CMS regulation. How come they're not getting Protonics to prevent a GI bleed? You know, hey, their blood volume, their RBC count is 50% below the normal low value. They probably need a transfusion. Things like that are being lost and forgotten because we've lowered the standard of care in the United States and Canada, the UK. It's really no different wherever you go in the first world countries. And so we tell them, hey, you need to ask for this, and that. And that way the family like knows exactly what to do. Sometimes we're on the call with them too. Typically, if like a hospital finds out I'm on the phone too, they're like, nope, click. Like, I can't tell you how many times that happens. It's like there must be like a wanted poster of my face and name up in all these hospitals, especially Texas.
Hospitals? Oh, okay, that's what I was going to ask is like, where's the craziest one that happened to you that you had no idea they even knew who you were?
Gosh, that was in like Texas. You know, I was just randomly helping this woman whose husband was like on a vent, and I introduced myself. I'm like, hi, I'm Nicole Sirotek. I'm so-and-so's nurse advocate. I'm just here to help bridge the gap and help with continuity of care, because a lot of times we actually make it easier for the nurses on the floor taking care of the patient, because I'm like, don't be wasting the nurse's time with this. You need to go to this person for that. And they're like, oh, well, you're going to have to call back and click. And then like the actual, like they had to get their legal team had to be on the call. And I'm like, what is going on here? Well, you're Nicole Sirotek and we know about you. I'm like, okay, you know about me, then you know I'm effective. Do what I'm telling you to do.
So we always, I don't know if you guys have watched Seinfeld. There's an episode where Elaine is difficult with her doctor, and she has like a rash, and she tries going to this clinic and this clinic, but that doctor sent out like a fax or an email had been a fax. But he sends it out, and she tries going to like 20 different doctors, and then she goes to one like in country bumpkin nowhere, and then I think he gets a fax in, and he's about to see her, and he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't see you. And this reminds me of that.
Well, it's kind of, I mean, from what you're saying, it kind of sounds like third world countries are doing a better job than these first world countries are.
I actually had a Canadian in Mexico. He was on vacation, caught COVID. And, you know, he was a diabetic and stuff like that, so he wasn't in, like, the best of health. And anyway, he ended up on a vent, and I'm just like, oh, you're in an XYZ hospital in Mexico? I'm like, oh, girl, you stay there. Don't go back to Canada. Do not go back to Canada. Like, you'll get better care there in Mexico. I'm like, seriously, you get better care in the field hospitals in Mexico and, like, in, like, the super rural areas where they don't even have, like, lights and running water. I'm like, you're better off there.
That's absurd.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, and we'll get to like this point. Like the number one thing you can do when you get in the hospital is refuse remdesivir. I cannot stress that enough. I absolutely guarantee you, if you take remdesivir, you'll die faster. Because that was like the drug that they were experimenting on with everybody in New York, and we watched it killing people. You know, pharma rolls up and they're like, oh, give this. I'm like, that's a failed Ebola drug. I watched it fail with Ebola in the Ebola outbreak. Okay. And so it's like the first thing we train our advocates is like find out how many doses of remdesivir did they get. Because if you get all 5 doses, and if you're in New York, they do 7 to 10, you're going to die faster, because it's going to cause, you know, increased fluid retention. It's going to shut down your kidneys. It's going to shut down your liver, and then they're going to blame it on COVID. And I'm like, no, I'm pretty sure that's your remdesivir. Because if you actually look at the numbers and everything like that, I think they said that they had like a experimental pool of like 1,900. I'm like, I saw more than that just die in New York on that. So I'm like, you'll just kick half these people out of your experimental study. But we teach the advocates, first thing, ask them how many doses of remdesivir were they on, because I'm like, that right there will tell us whether or not we can even save you. I mean, we'll still try. But 10, you know, if you get remdesivir on day 1 and you get all 5 courses, so from day 1 of remdesivir, you go day 10 to 15, you're going to start to tank. You're going to see increased CRP levels. You're going to see increased ferritin levels. Your white blood cell count is going to tank. your BNP is going to increase. I mean, there's like a whole like, it's like textbook, boom, 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 boom. We know exactly what's going to happen. And there's actually like this one doctor who's like championing, like taking down remdesivir, and that's Dr. Artis, if you don't follow his podcast, but you can go on to his website. I gave him most of the information. Because I had it from New York, gave him all the experimental study papers and everything like that. Like, I'm like, oh, here's all the charts. And stuff like that they were giving out. And I'm like, oh no, they were giving this out. We knew that it was killing people back then, and it's still killing people now. And that's like the number one thing you can do is decline the remdesivir. The hospital has a vested, and it doesn't matter if it's our hospital, any hospital in the United States, first world country, has a vested interest in giving remdesivir, because the hospital systems get like a 20% kickback from the profit of that drug. So it's just like, and if you say you don't want remdesivir, then they typically send you home, and you'll probably survive anyway.
Jesus.
So
I have a question. Somebody sent a question in from the public to ask you.
Oh, is this like live?
We're live.
Oh,
now.
shoot,
We're
man.
live. We're
If
live
I'd known,
now.
I would have been like paying attention to questions. I'm like, oh, shoot, what's that question?
So this question is to ask you if they've isolated the original virus and how they can test for the different variants.
You actually can't test for the variants. You actually have to send them off to be sequenced. So the only sequencing that gets done is in Las Vegas and Reno. So when they say that they sent out, I mean, it's actually like, it's not a simple process. There's a special machine. It's actually really expensive. So the test will just tell you if you're positive or negative for a sequence of Rona. It doesn't tell you what the variant is. So how they tell what the dominant variant is in an area is they do random sample population. So of all of these swabs, they take the swabs and like they'll take a couple of them and then they'll send those off to be sequenced, and they'll find out what lineage variant it is. And if so many of them pop up as a particular lineage, it like, oh, that's your dominant variant in that area. And typically our dominant variant, half the time we don't even know what it is until one of the news names comes up, and then they're like, oh, now it's Omicron, now it's Delta. I mean, did anyone talk about like, I was in that school board meeting when like Putnam was talking about the South African variant. I'm like, yeah, 3 kids had South African variant, but it was actually a completely different lineage that was actually dominant in our area. So that was just random sample error. Like, this goes back to statistics and like how we're trained, like, because I was trained as a biochemist, like what you're supposed to do. But then again, I don't know. I'm just a nurse. I'm not a dentist, so maybe my opinion doesn't matter. So I don't know.
Can you check my tooth?
Yeah, right.
I got a toothache.
Oh, shoot.
She's
Most people are like
underqualified for
prostate
that.
exams. I'm like, no, I do not do prostate exams. Please go see your doctor.
Danny, you're up.
Oh, jeez.
You're up.
So, okay, well, we're getting close to our hour here. We could really do this for hours and hours, and we hope to have you back on. But kind of want to send it out to let you. If you were in charge, Nicole, what would you be doing, and what can you tell the community to help protect themselves from the Rona, and what they can do moving forward in this pandemic?
Yeah, sure. If I was in charge, like I was in several other countries, we would be over this by now. Just ask El Salvador and like Chile and most recently Egypt. That's where our legal counsel is right now. Like, yeah, there's like nothing going on in Egypt. She's like, it's like super chill here.
Wow.
No masks, no nothing. Nothing. No, you just go buy your ivermectin for $20. And I'm like, okay, yeah, sweet. So yeah, just, I guess like you have to go back all into that FLCCCI mask protocol, but if you go onto AmericanFrontlineNurses.com and you go under the early intervention tab, it's going to give you a link to the FLCCC. Go look at the protocol. It's like vitamin D, vitamin C, zinc, some Q-Certin, all those supplements, you can get from Natural Nutrition. Debbie and Arlene will take care of you, and I think they give you like a 10% discount. And if you need to get the actual pharmaceutical ivermectin, you can go to riverpharmacy.com or what we recommend on the website is All Day Chemist. It takes about 4 weeks to get it because it comes from India. And if you need the actual written prescription much sooner, you can actually go to myfreedoctor.com or Push Health, and the doctors there will prescribe it to you. And then you just follow the FLCCC protocol that Dr. Pierre Corey and Dr. Merrick wrote up, and follow that, and you'll kick it very quickly. I can kick it with like 1 dose of ivermectin. I caught it like 7 times. So if anyone's telling you can only catch it once, I don't think they know science. You're going to catch it all the time. It's here forever, guys. It's here forever.
It's not going anywhere.
It's not going anywhere.
I know Danny probably might have another question or anything, but we were talking about this before we went live. Sorry, I talk with my hands because I've.
Oh, it's all right. I try not to because then I start hitting things.
Sometimes I feel rude. You know, like when the chief is sitting here and where I'm like going like that.
Oh no,
but
you're fine.
When you do like radio imaging, you want to try and be animated because it makes you sound better. So I'm so used to doing that. I would.
Yeah, I hold my hands because when I'm in podcasts and like studios, and because like they're like, well, if you go on Joe Rogan, you can't like. There's all this equipment, and I'm like, oh shoot, I'm gonna start hitting stuff. I'm just gonna hold my hands in my lap.
So I've noticed that some of the videos when I go back and watch them, you know, I'm like sitting here going like this and like this, but I'm just so used to it when I talk into a microphone that hey, you know. So anyways, I digress. But I was gonna ask about. We were talking about smell. I had the virus. You recommended something for my smell because my smell still hasn't completely, actually fully come back. I can smell food if I put it right up to my nose, but when I walk into a room, like I can't smell like aromas. You know, like when you walk into a room, if someone's got something in the crock pot, you usually can smell the aroma, but I can't smell that. It smells. Quite honestly, it smells like shit to me.
Everything all smells the same. There's a growing body of evidence, and you have to search back like before 2020. Alpha lipoic acid it's a supplement. It actually works to like regenerate your olfactory nerves, and like a lot of the studies are from like 2002. Like it works for your the loss of sense of like taste and smell is not something new that came on with Rona. It happens with like lots of upper respiratory viruses and like lower respiratory viruses. So none of this is new. There's a whole growing body of research on alpha lipoic acid, 600 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams daily for like 30 days to help get that back. And you can find all those research studies. And if you want to get the alpha lipoic acid, it's just a supplement. It's not going to hurt you or nothing like that. You can actually get it from Natural Nutrition too. They have it stockpiled ready for people. And then you can also do smell retraining, where you smell like the different oils. Like people are talking about like this burnt orange thing, and I'm like, I don't know. Like you could probably try it. I have no idea if that works. I'm like, I know from the science that alpha lipoic acid works for most people. So
what do you burn an orange and smell it?
Yeah, I've been seeing like TikTok videos. People are like, hey Nicole, does this work? And I'm like, I don't really know if it works or not. I just know that the science says that alpha lipoic acid works. So
go get a lighter, and I'm gonna go buy an orange.
Right?
Yeah, and I'm like, it doesn't. Yeah, I'm like, people like they start to do all sorts of like weird, crazy stuff, like coffee enemas. I'm like, nothing should go up your butt, please. Nothing goes up there.
Again,
coffee has the opposite effect on me.
It's like weird. I'm like, what are you doing? What is going on? Like, well, somebody said this would work, and I'm like, you can also like cover yourself in peanut butter and go like howl at the harvest moon and align your chakras. But I mean, the science doesn't like. The science says this works, and I'm gonna run with this.
That being said, I'm asking Nicole as a friend, not as she's not a doctor, but I'm just asking for advice. So I just wanted to throw it out there so I don't get you in trouble for giving me
medical advice. Oh, the state board has already like got plenty of complaints about me. I'm like this rogue nurse saving lives.
That's the worst of. That's like the worst of. That's the last thing she's worried about. She's like, I got a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah, I got bigger fish coming after me.
Right? I'm like, I've gone a couple months without the FBI and Department of Justice stopping by my house, so I'm like, that's kind of nice. I mean, that's when I'll freak out. I'm like,
I'm just throwing that out as a disclaimer. She's telling me as a friend.
So yeah, it's
I don't need a doctor's order to give my kids some Tylenol when they have a fever. Right. Like, I mean, come on, I'm not a nurse 24/7, guys.
If you got that many people on you,
I don't need to be a nurse that when you cut your finger off, I should say, well, you should probably go to the doctor for that. Go to the ER.
Right now, that's kind of a touchy subject. You struck a nerve right there because
it takes a while.
I seriously
to get that nerve feeling back.
I think about it and I'm like, I could have easily taken my finger off on that thing because when we're done, I want you to feel the corner of.
Well, you're lucky it wasn't your index finger and your thumb. Those are the two most important.
Well, this one's pretty important.
Only if you need to flip people off.
Okay.
Ben.
No, I just we're right up against our time limit here, so I want to thank you for coming on, Nicole.
Yeah, anytime.
It's absurd to me that somebody that saved thousands of lives is being blackballed in the medical community. So keep doing you.
It.
There's some girl. There's some comments out there, positive comments on our live that are thanking you for what you do, and I thank you.
Oh yeah.
Anytime I've texted Nicole or called Nicole. She's responded back immediately, and I look forward to seeing your interview on Joe Rogan. And
hopefully they're like, well, we need more like stats and like what you do. I'm like, bro, I save lives in real time.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know what you expect, like thousands of lives, like literally.
We'll hashtag him in this, and hopefully maybe he'll see it so he can kind of play off of our questions. Maybe, I don't know,
or even just see the knowledge that you have. I was really surprised. We could seriously sit here and talk for probably about 5 hours, maybe even longer, just based off your knowledge. And if that's the dumbed down version, what you gave us,
we do a lot of like early intervention teaching where we'll like teach like courses on this and bring out like printed material and give you like a little patient handbook and stuff like that. We did that a lot in Texas and like back in, like in the South. And we typically partnered with churches and stuff like that because that's like their community centers, especially like in Texas with all their mega churches. I'm like, oh my gosh, this church is like nicer than like any place I've ever been. And but typically like in Nevada and stuff like that, we don't have like that church strength, so I'm probably gonna have to like, well, right now I have to fly back and forth like from Florida and Texas a couple times this month, but I definitely need to teach one of those classes here because we offer it completely free, all the marketing materials and that. So if you guys can donate to AmericanFrontlineNurses.com, that'd be super great because that's how we pay to do these classes for free for everybody. But yeah, I can definitely like do another one of these and like do step by step, like this is what you're supposed to do, this is what you ask your doctor, this is where you go for services, this is what you do in the situation, or if you just need me to answer like random questions. Like I do a lot of Facebook Lives when I'm not deplatformed, and I'm like, okay, what's your question? And then we just answer questions all the time. And if you do have questions or you need help, we also have, if you go on to AmericanFrontlineNurses.com, we have Ask an Advocate Zooms where you can just go on and jump onto this Zoom and we just help random strangers and direct them onto what they're supposed to do when they're sick, or what they have to do if their loved one's in the hospital and things like that. So we offer those completely free as well. And then you can also like hire a consultant, like a nurse advocate too, if you're in a real jam and you need someone to like fight for you in the hospital. So that way the hospitals don't kill your loved one.
So the early intervention, is that just for the Rona or for all the diseases or viruses? Or
well, we can definitely tell you to eat organic food and not eat McDonald's and all that kind of stuff too. We have a nutritionist named Christy Korth. She'll handle that whole anti-inflammatory diet thing. And stuff like that. But yeah, we do all sorts of things. Like right now, the biggest issue is Rona because of the unsafe, unequitable, like inappropriate care people are getting. But we do all sorts of stuff. We had, people talking about like, what am I supposed to do with like my kids and like newly diagnosed asthmatic? I don't know how to work this freaking inhaler. Like we use nursing knowledge to teach people what they're supposed to do.
So eating fast food isn't healthy?
No. We literally...
That's news to me.
I mean, the occasional chicken nugget and whatever is fine, but I'm like, at the frequency that Americans are eating bad food, like, it's not good. We shouldn't be eating that. Like, well... It's weird because when you go into like different towns and you're waking up early to get to like a studio or to a venue or something like that, I'm like, it's 5 o'clock in the morning and there are no cars out here. And why are the gas stations closed?
Right.
Because I'm used to them being open and that's like our hubs in the morning, for the mine traffic. And I'm like, yeah, you can't eat biscuits and gravy every day. I asked my husband, I'm like, how come you're not eating that organic bread? Like I was in the middle of a Zoom. He's like, where's the bread? I'm like, it's there. It's like that organic, Ezekiel bread. He's like, no, real bread. I'm like, eat the organic bread I bought with the organic tomatoes.
Wife, listen to your wife. She knows what she's talking about. So, all right. Well, we know you got an appointment coming up here shortly. So, once again, thank you for coming on.
Yeah,
Nicole.
anytime.
We appreciate it, and keep being badass and keep doing.
Yeah, anytime. Let me know if you need me back for any more teaching and training and stuff.
Heck yeah.
Outstanding. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you tune in this evening for Talking Sports with Pedro and Danny. We're Battleborn Media Networks, and this was Nicole Sirotek. Have a wonderful rest of your day.